Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
Can you give a basis for that judgment?
Can't even close my eyes.
It wasn't that black parents were desperate to have their kids sit next to white kids in school. That wasn't the point, right? The point was that if the schools were segregated by race, they were never going to be equal.
I'm sorry, but I don't think it's the time right now. I think they have equal rights, Dave.
Although the civil rights movement is dated from 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott, African American activists had been pushing for years for equal rights. There was a mass movement in the 1930s and 40s that was suppressed by the anti-communist movement during World War II. The Brown versus Board decision was an opportunity to remobilize the movement and gave hope to African Americans that change could happen. To these activists, the Brown versus Board decision could be a new emancipation proclamation.
Of course, we've all discussed this and we've all said that the answer to the problem is eventually when you find that there are no more areas to which a white person can move without having a Negro family. And, well, that will be the best end that there could be to segregation. And it is probably something that will happen in the future.
In 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the legality of segregation in the case Plessy v. Ferguson. When Homer Plessy sat in a whites-only car, he challenged the separate but equal accommodations. When the Supreme Court decided against him, they cemented this doctrine for decades to come. Segregated school systems were massively different. In one county in South Carolina, the school system spent $149 per year for each white student and only $43 on each black student. Nearly 60 years later, a unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka partially overruled this precedent and stated that separate school systems are inherently unequal.
The Brown decision was rooted in a way of thinking about racism and race relations in the post-war period that's often referred to as racial liberalism. And racial liberalism, in a sense, comes out of that era's emphasis on psychology. And so the case that was made in Brown v. Board of Education and the case that convinced the court was a psychological case.
A psychological experiment conducted by Dr. Kenneth Clark in 1939 served as evidence of the psychological burden placed on minority students in segregated schools. In a study of 300 children across the country, black children who attended segregated schools were more likely to place positive attributes on a white doll than a black one. Even though the physical facilities of the segregated schools were similar, the court decided that segregated schools deprived minority students of education opportunities and led to a feeling of inferiority.
I just don't understand it. Don't approve of it. I'm going to stand up for my rights.
The NAACP always focused on legal action to get the federal government to enforce the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal rights for all citizens. After the repression of the movement from anti-communist fears, the courts were a safer place to pursue change. They began with emphasis on equality in the context of separate but equal, but they eventually tried to eradicate segregation entirely.
If you were a family bringing a civil rights case like this from a Southern community, you were at great risk, right? So people did put themselves at risk for these cases.
Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the court, was determined to get a ruling in favor of desegregation. He knew the decision was going to be controversial, so he needed to get a unanimous decision. While the court ruled that separate but equal educational facilities were unconstitutional, they did not decide how this decision should be carried out. This left several questions that were answered a year later in Brown 2. In a unanimous decision, Chief Justice Earl Warren required that states needed to integrate schools with all deliberate speed. Unfortunately, this unclear phrasing led to little actual change. This confusion gave resistance in the South time to grow and mobilize to prevent integration.
You know, you had Governor, say in Little Rock, Arkansas, Orville Falbus had been kind of a racial moderate. But the political situation for him, right, he was sort of pushed into this situation where he kind of had to, you know, pound his chest and stand up and be a full-throated segregationist.
rural areas in the South were at the forefront of this resistance movement. The disproportionate power of the rural South outweighed the progressive urban population, forcing Southern representatives to work against integration. This plan was known as massive resistance and persisted for more than a decade after the decision of Brown versus Board.
One of the effects of the Brown decision was to kind of remobilize people and make them realize that there was some hope of change, and that it was worth risking, risking lives, risking all kinds of things to actually push harder for equal rights.
The Brown versus Board decision was a major event across the entire country. Southern political leaders tried to get the federal government to enforce desegregation in the North as well. However, this was not an attempt to aid desegregation, but rather to mobilize Northern white Americans to resist the civil rights movement. As a last-ditch effort, many Southern schools closed their doors completely to protest desegregation. This alienated many moderate whites. Most weren't happy with desegregation, but were willing to accept it rather than extending the school closure. Over time, Southern schools gradually moved forward with integration.
The South is often portrayed as kind of monolithic. The white South is portrayed as monolithically, apoplectic about this decision. In fact, initially, the response was calmer. There were school districts in the Upper South that sort of quickly and without a lot of incident desegregated.
Well, I can't find my
The victories in Brown versus Board were due to the actions of many brave families. By bringing cases to trial, families risked their jobs, their standing in their community, and their lives. These activists fought racism in the best way they could and brought around real change. The decision in Brown versus Board revitalized the previously stalled civil rights movement and encouraged others to fight for equality. Today, we can take inspiration from this effort. Taking risks, using the tools we have access to, and focusing on systematic problems can help. Injustice has changed over time, but activists have the same spirit to sacrifice for what they believe in.
Well, my baby can't be found. Well, if I don't find my baby, I'm going down to the bowling ground. That's where the men hang out at.